So this video starts off the last topic, which is the emergence of a superpower. So this video looks mainly at America during World War II, but not necessarily events of World War II, but more how World War II transformed America economically and socially. So Pearl Harbor marked the official arrival of America to World War II, and this was well and truly the end of isolationism as the citizens of America knew it. But as we saw in the isolationist PowerPoint previously, you can see that FDR was taking steps that directly contradicted America's commitment to isolationism, such as cash and carry and the Lend-Lease agreement. And so after Pearl Harbor occurred, that well and truly got the publics on board with FDR's war plans, and Congress declared war on Japan. And now America felt that they had a personal reason to get behind the war effort. So I guess there's two theatres of World War II, as you know. There's the war in the Pacific, which I guess was more immediately in America's sphere of influence. I guess America and Japan are on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean, and so America adopted this strategy of island hopping, which was, it's a long distance between Japan and the United States, too far to fly a plane in one go, or too long to actually directly send ships back and forward. So island hopping was, I guess, taking one island at a time and setting up base and then launching planes from there to the next attack. And so that's what island hopping means. It is, I guess, gradually taking island by island as they got closer and closer to Japan and its empire in Southeast Asia that it was beginning to develop. And the war in Europe, consists of not just Europe, but North Africa as well. And so America, as of 1942 onwards, had a huge impact, not just in terms of the soldiers, but in terms of the economy as well, and the money that they could bring to the Allied cause. So in terms of America as a superpower, this is probably the most important factor that America got involved with, and it's, I guess, the diplomacy. And America, after those 2 decades of isolationism, America coming to the table and being an active participant in shaping the world, and meeting with other world leaders. So these conferences, ones that we've discussed before in the Cold War topic at the start of the year. The Yalta Conference was particularly important because that was where the big three got together to discuss what the world would look like after World War II. And so these conferences, it was only 5 years earlier that America was sort of really committing itself to remaining neutral and isolationist, and now it is slowly rising to become, almost the lone superpower at the conclusion of World War II. And so in April 1945, FDR passed away, and his Vice President Harry Truman took over. So FDR was actually elected to an unconstitutional 4 terms as president, when previously it had only been 2, and still is 2. I guess because of the crises that America faced, the Great Depression and then World War II. FDR realised that he was the best leader and the most experienced leader, and so he decided to run for those 2 extra elections. But overall, he was a very well liked leader, and now Harry Truman actually came in and had to prove himself. He'd only been vice president for 3 months before he had to step up, and he actually had no prior knowledge of the secret Manhattan Project that had been going on behind the scenes since 1943. And so, over those 2 years, American scientists developed the atomic bomb. It had been tested out in the desert in Nevada, and in the middle of 1945, they had this bomb ready to go. And now the debate was, do we drop it or not? I have that phrase down the bottom: wartime innovation is rapid. I guess during times of conflict, especially on the scale of the world wars. Innovation and invention and production is extremely rapid, and it's just magnified because of the competition that's going on around the world. And in this case, it's a fairly sinister development, the atomic bomb. But other things like food production and medicine and other communications technology is also one of those positive byproducts of world conflict, just because of the rate at which it develops, and every country is trying to outdo the next. And I guess it's that competition and rivalry, kind of like capitalism in a way. That competition really drives innovation and change. And so here's an example of the atomic bomb, the little boys. This was the first one that was dropped on the 6th of August in 1945. It's sort of the size of a small car, and this was this unknown weapon that America had developed that they had to sort of decide, are we going to unleash this on humans or not? And as we know, they did. So across the two bombings, over 200,000 Japanese civilians died for the two bombs that were dropped at the start of August. And I guess one thing we've got to look at is why the United States decided to drop the bomb. And so America's official reason for dropping the bomb was, they saw that the only way they were going to defeat the Japanese, apart from using the bomb, was to actually launch an invasion of Japan itself. And because of the way the Japanese had been fighting, they proved to be very fanatical, opponents. We know about the kamikaze style attacks in the Pacific, and they estimated that invading Japan by force and defeating them on their home soil, due to lots of different factors, would be a very costly in terms of lives and resources, but also a very long affair. They estimated it could go on for another couple of years. And so, in terms of dropping the bomb, they sort of justified the decision by killing a few in the short term to save a lot more in the long term. But there's more to the decision than just this. America was also looking beyond the World War, and by that stage, I guess the seeds of the Cold War were already, definitely being sown. America and the Soviet Union, I guess, were forced to be allies due to their mutual hatred for Hitler, but they weren't friends by any measure. And dating all the way back to the first Red Scare, which came after the Russian Revolution, and America's involvement in the Russian Civil War, these two countries had always sort of had it in for each other, and the spying had already begun during the atomic development. And so I guess the ulterior motive for America was actually showing off and flexing their muscles to other nations like the Soviet Union, and saying, we've got this new technology, and therefore we rule the world pretty much. And so now we're going to look more at the home front during World War II, and this first part looks more at the economy and how America, I guess, lifted itself out of the Great Depression. By 1937, it was clear that the Second New Deal was not working, and unemployment rates started to go back up in a period that was nicknamed the Roosevelt Recession. And coincidentally, around this time, I guess FDR started to look for ways, look outside America and look for ways that they could actually stimulate the economy. And as we know, a lot of those actually contradicted America's commitment to isolationism, such as the cash and carry and the Lend-Lease Agreement, and then economic, I guess, warfare with Japan prior to Pearl Harbor. These are all things that directly contradicted the neutrality acts that were passed in the mid-1930s, and showed that FDR, I guess for moral reasons, but also economic reasons, was looking and planning ahead. And I guess he saw World War II as being inevitable. So America, I guess their wartime production was known as the Arsenal of Democracy. And this was a nickname, I guess, coined by FDR prior to World War II, prior to them getting involved in World War II, but saying, if we stay out of World War II, well, we're going to be the arsenal of democracy. We're going to make those weapons and give the money needed to help the Allies win. And so the War Production Board was set up, and its goal was basically to transform American industry and maximise output, all directed towards maximising their war effort and the amount of resources and goods that they could give to their allies. And so this board had great power over resources. I guess during times of war, the government almost has unlimited sort of scope as to, I guess, in a way, democracy sort of goes out the window. In America, the government had to sort of take charge of all of these things, and so, there were shades of the Great Depression again with the amount of rationing that was going on of food and fuel. Cars pretty much completely stopped being made during World War II. I think there was something like only 200 cars that were made during that whole period, because all of those industries, especially machinery and things like that, all was focused towards now making planes, contributing to making ships and tanks and other things like that. And some pretty incredible statistics here. So by 1944, the US was producing a plane every 5 minutes and one battleship per day. And the government spent over $300 billion in that 5-year period, which I think was something like 7 times the amount that the government had to spend on the New Deal programs. Now that's obviously in overdrive, increasing this production for World War II. And so government expenditure during World War II was double the last 150 years of its history combined, which is a pretty massive sum. And so how did this affect people? So taxes increased, and basically war bonds became a huge thing. So the government was actually asking its citizens to lend them money. Usually it's the other way around when we take out a loan to buy a house or something like that. But citizens were encouraged to actually give money back to the government that they would then eventually pay back with interest later on. And we're so used to having that the other way around. And so FDR obviously had a thing for these government agencies because hundreds were created during World War II, but it was all, I guess, kind of like the New Deal, it was all designed to maximise the efficiency of American production and make sure everything was maximised and the Allies could get the most benefit out of it. And so there were lots of social developments as well during this period. A fairly dark chapter of World War II on the American home front was the internment of Japanese Americans. And so during World War II, over 100,000 Japanese citizens were actually some born in Japan and had emigrated to the United States. Others were Japanese descent born in the United States. But lots of them were actually rounded up and put in internment camps after FDR issued the Executive Order 9066. So lots of these internment camps, as you can see, were on the west coast, which kind of makes sense because that's the Pacific side of the United States. And we've already got a world war that was infamous for concentration camps and prisoner of war camps. So this wasn't quite that extreme, but it was obviously imprisoning lots of these Americans, mostly with Japanese descent, and I guess for the purpose of national security. So lots of these people were forced to move into these camps to sell their homes, and across those 100,000 plus citizens, it was estimated that they actually lost $2 billion collectively by being forced to live in these camps. And yeah, although not being concentration camps, the conditions were fairly poor. So in 1988, a bill was brought to the government by Norman Mineta, and the government under Ronald Reagan had to formally apologise and compensate the Japanese people and their descendants that were kept in these groups, as were other groups to a smaller extent, German Americans and Italians, etc. So obviously the enemies of America during World War II. And so the experiences of African Americans during the war, like the New Deal, didn't actually change much. There was still segregation and intolerance that existed, and not just in terms of the actual soldiers, but also in terms of the jobs that were available. There were real echoes of the previous decade in terms of lots of African American unemployment, and they missed out on lots of the benefits of this new economic growth. And I guess one of the ironies of World War II is this double V campaign. The African American community really campaigned for this double victory. Victory, against Hitler and their overseas enemies, but also against intolerance and injustice at home. So winning, I guess, victory on two fronts. And this was a good forerunner for the civil rights movement, which followed in the decades afterwards.